I've got a question.
Okay.
I've heard you put hardies and tropicals at different depths,
Mhm.
and if they're too deep, they won't grow as well as if they're. Is that true?
Yeah, that's a good thing for us to cover in the whole repotting concept. So when you repot, in the spring it's not as big of a deal because the water is pretty safe to work with. But when you repot a plant that's accustomed to living on the surface, you need to make sure it's still living on the surface. All right? Because this plant breathes in two ways. One, it gets some oxygen through the water table, through the roots. The other way it breathes, though, is it actually breathes with the pads that are outside of the water. So if we were to come through in the spring, repotting anyways, snap them all and put them back in, they're going to survive, but it's going to take a while. But if we were to do that in the middle of the summer, we were to snap them and stick them in 3 feet of water, you just kill the plant. Because there's no way for the plant to get enough oxygen now, because you took away a big section of the breathing piece. So when you repot, when you clean your pond or whatever, sometimes you have to take that pot, instead of sticking it back in 3 feet of water, you stick it in the 1 foot edge. And then a couple months later, you'll put it where it belongs. Or you stack 1 or 2 cinder blocks up on their sides or rocks and raise it up until it's nice and wide, and then you remove a cinder block and remove a cinder block. But you do want, if at all possible, you want the pads, at least one pad, on the surface, or close enough to where in a couple of days it's going to grow and touch the surface. If it's going to be more than a week or so that it can't breathe on the surface, you're really risking stuff. Now, the other piece of your question is hardies do not make it as deep as tropicals because they're not as big of plants. So generally 6 inches to 3 foot deep is where you put hardies. Unless they're super mature, your friend probably can stick them in 6 feet of water because they have really long stems, but a normal hardy doesn't. So 6 inches to 3 feet, whereas tropicals can hit 5 foot, even 6 or 7 foot if the water's clear enough, so long as it has grown into that depth, and the pads can still touch the surface.
I didn't know that, Mom.
Oh yeah, change the tropical or how deep? Up to?
I always say up to 5 feet, but I mean, I've seen them in deeper, but then that's clear water, that's warm water. And like I said, they grew into it, so you stair-stepped them down, so they just continue to grow longer and longer stems.
And
all the
we've
time.
got some parties in our deep side that, they just on the bottom and they.
Yeah, and they can, once they do it for one season, and they can reach up there, they're good to go.
That's
But if
right.
you drop this guy in 5 or 6 feet of water, he's never gonna make it.
It's gonna take forever.
Yeah.
If that.
Yeah.
How do you keep your fish from rooting around in the pots and digging up the?
Yeah.
You don't have koi.
You eliminate a variable. Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do. I'll tell you what I do, is I don't use these pots. When I get these plants, I put them in what's called a lotus tub or a lily pot, and they're wide and they're shallow, okay? And I'll put 2 or 3 of them in one pot instead of having 3 separate pots. Fill it with the dirt and the sand, and then I take flagstones, size of my hand or bigger, and I set them on there. So I basically have flagstones and a plant coming out. Now those koi can pick up little rocks, they can pick up coarse gravel, they can even pick up lava rocks if they're big enough. It kind of bothers their mouths and their little fish, but when they get to be 8 pounds, they just pick up the lava rocks, and that's no longer a good option. But they can't move a flagstone. So in my pond, I actually have 3 of these tubs, pow, pow, pow. It's kind of like a triangle. And I've created a web of cinder block of flagstones on top of it, which also created a swim-through cave, and they can't mess with them. Otherwise, the black Mexican sandstone rocks, they're big enough they can't move something, fist size to put in there, but you can't fit very many fist-sized rocks in this pot. So really, to be successful, you've got to get rid of the small pots and get something bigger that allows you to put something large enough that they can't move. There's all kinds of weird contraptions over time that's created that you zip tie plastic mesh on it and cut a hole in the middle of the plastic mesh and let the plant, that works. But eventually the plant can't continue to grow as big as it would, so now you've got a maintenance, an annual maintenance on your hands.
So the flat rocks wouldn't keep them from growing?
No, because you have just enough, I can leave this much space between the flat rocks, the koi can't get there. I can even leave this much space, the koi can't get there.
So it's just like mulching a plant.
It's like mulching a plant, just with something heavy enough that the koi can't move and pick up. And another thing, and this doesn't work real well with water gardens in most situations, but I've seen it done with koi ponds, and I did it 1 year with my koi pond, is you have a plant shelf. That's the way mine's built. So I have a 7-foot deep koi pond, and then I have a 2.5-foot deep plant shelf that's about the size of 2 of these tables. And that's where my water lilies sit, and I built a fence. And those fish couldn't get into my water lilies, so it didn't matter. And that worked great, and the plants grew, and they grew like crazy, and then they kind of went over and hid over the floating layer of the fence. And that was all good and fine until finally 2 of my big ones figured out how to move the fence, and the fence fell in the 7-foot deep water. And I had a few words with them, and I dove in, and then I started doing the rock thing, because
So how did you make the fence?
well, so what I did, that was the problem, and that's why I didn't remake it. I did a PVC frame, and then I took the rigid plastic mesh sold here, and I zip tied it around all the edges, and I shoved it into against 2 walls. But once the fish were able to move one, well, you can't permanently attach it to a lighter. And so I'm like, no, this is too it worked great for a season, gave me, and I'm not doing it again. So, I could have maybe done it better. I just didn't want to.
They're like a raccoon. The raccoon loves a challenge.
Yes.
And so are the koi.
And I gave him one. Yeah. I dare y'all to figure out how to get through this fence. All right.
I got a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Forgive my ignorance here, but when you plant them, since your friend had whatever it's called, the resin grow out of the pot, it was all along the pond, do you have to have dirt when you originally plant these?
The original planting should have dirt.
So it starts growing, you don't need.
It's going to end up, all the roots are going to end up holding onto a bunch of muck,
Yeah.
like muck at the bottom of your pond, and they're going to create their own dirt environment, even if they're suspended in the middle of the water.
But once you clean it out,
Then you took all that away, and now you've got bare roots.
Then you have to plant them.
You should, or at least if you take all the muck away, then you need to put them in some sort of dirt, because their roots want to hold on to something. It doesn't need to get nutrients through the dirt, but it needs the root structure to be solid.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's kind of a feeble plant and it doesn't feel secure to grow well. And it free floats around. But you could, so I did this at one pond. It was a situation like that, and we went out, one of my sons and I went out to clean her pond. And we knew the disaster that would happen because she had no filter system if we actually did a full cleaning around the water lilies. So what we did was we took the vacuum and we all around just cleaned the sides of the muck so you couldn't see the muck. So now you have this beautiful island of water lilies without this nasty green root system muck going underneath it. So she still had most everything, but not everything. We got rid of pounds and pounds and pounds of fish food. And so then that was an okay thing to do. But if we'd actually pulled those plants out, cleaned them and stuck them back in, a lot of them would have died because of the trauma of the change we created. And if we had stuck them all back in and made only sure that the ones we stuck in were going to live, the pond was going to turn green in 5 days and we were going to get a phone call. You didn't clean my pond right. I'm like, no, it's not really the problem. So it's kind of situational what you want to do and accomplish.
Okay, another question on that. I've read, I have a pretty good about lilies, they seem to grow okay, but I just use dirt filter.
Mm-hmm.
And Home Depot quit carrying, at least I couldn't find it last year, so I tried to get something that didn't have a lot of fertilizer in it, and all that stuff comes to the top. So what kind of dirt do you first plant?
Yeah, you want to use a clay mix topsoil.
Like clay mix, okay. Do they
No
sell
mulch.
that at the stores?
Yeah, it's hard to get at stores. Now you're more likely to get it at a feed store or a farm to market store than you are to get it at a Lowe's or a Home Depot.
I just used dirt filter before, it would be okay, but they quit carrying for some reason last year.
Yeah.
2 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually aquatic plant media that you buy. A bag of water lily dirt.
Really?
Yeah, and I assume this place may not have it yet because it's early in the season, but we've sold it in the past that you can use. But you can also, theoretically, depending on where you live and what kind of dirt you have in your backyard, dirt is dirt. But you want enough clay mix that the roots can grab a hold of it securely and not have the plant float back up. You can use sand if it's a really mature pond, and the plant's going to get the fertilizer and all the food that it needs out of the water and not require a lot, but the sand could allow, especially if you have a turbulent pond, could allow that water lily roots to just pull right out of the sand, because the sand doesn't clump together like clay does. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, if you could just, you could go to, buy just a pile of dirt in your back of your truck if you wanted, and if it was sandy loam or if it was a clay topsoil loam mix, you're good. I don't like using dirt out of the back of your yard, having I just said that, precursor, because you or somebody else has used chemicals and fertilizers.
Yep.
And you stuck them in the water now, and that's very, very dangerous to the fish. You could kill them all overnight, or you could get real lucky, but you don't know. So I don't like using the dirt to shovel dirt out of your yard, but in theory it would work if you knew it was clean.
And topsoil has all that mulchy stuff in it, and it
And the
floats to the
perlite.
top,
Yeah,
and then you have
Yeah, perlite, you can't use potting soil, you can't use any of the pre-mixed fertilizer soils that's what the big block retailers sell, because they're not really selling, you're not their market.
No.
They're selling to the person that's got a bunch of raised beds and she just wants to pretty up the beds and put a little more energy into the soil every spring. And so they don't care about what you're looking for. That's why it's harder to find the big blocks that are turning niches. You're more likely to find it in an actual rock and soil yard company or a farm market place. Farmer's place, yeah.
What about pea gravel?
Pea gravel is fine, so long as it's a mature pond that's got a lot of nutrients in it so that there's nothing required from it.
The same way, glad you mentioned sand, you know.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned sand, because I've been using that too, so it's okay, but,
It's fine, so long as your plant doesn't float up out of it.
Right.
You know, and it makes it really easy for the fish to pull it out of sand or even pea gravel. So if you do have mature fish in there, even if they're not trying to eat the roots and they're just messing with the plants, which even goldfish will do, they could pull it out and now you got floaters all
I
over
do
the
put
place.
the bigger stones, you know.
Then you're fine.
On top of it.
Then you're fine.
And the other thing, when you're repotting the hardy specifically, Betty Fairchild always said she cuts back everything on the root system except like 3 leaves, or maybe some sprouting leaves, and then just leaving a little bit of that rhizome.
Mhm.
And,
Did it live?
oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. that's-
Betty had tremendous, you know.
Oh, yeah, she was the expert.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, I'm pretty sure almost everybody in this room gardens outside the water as well, right? And so when you buy a new tree or a new shrub or whatever, if there's anything weak in the roots, you ought to take some of the top off. And if you ever move a plant, you killed a bunch of the roots with your shovel, you need to take some of the top off. Because it's true, because whatever the root has grown is exactly what is needed for the size of top that you have. If you lost some root, now you've got too much top and it's gonna hurt the plant. So yes, you can definitely trim back, and that allows you to have more root than you need, so the plant's gonna rebound faster because it can. There's no question. And you don't need, like, I just reached in and tore this off, and I had over double the length of the roots, and I didn't wanna make a mess. So I'm just snapping everything, because you don't need all that stuff. And this plant's gonna grow that right back. And it's probably gonna be healthier for getting to grow fresh roots anyways than using old roots. So yeah, for sure, you could just do the 2 little stubs. If it was me, I would leave any of these pads that are healthy. So I got 2